Please help me welcome General George W. Casey, Jr., Chief of Staff, United States Army. General Casey.
Thank you. Great to be here with you. And for all you math majors out there, yes, that is 40 years since I was commissioned. And I must say, I was not a Marshall Award winner from my school at that time. This is the third time I've been down here talking to this group, and it is always wonderful to get down and meet you and see you. And what I like to try to do here is to set the context, to give you some perspective about the Army that you're joining. First, I have to try something. There's a sergeant major running around here that tells my general joke all the time. Has he told it yet? No, okay. Okay, so there's a Apache pilot, a general, Army general, and a sergeant major. And they're all in a prisoner of war camp. And the commandant comes in one day and I says, hey, I have some bad news. Tomorrow at dawn, you're going to face the firing squad. He goes to the Apache pilot and says, Major, what's your last request? He says, I'd like to have my last meal by candlelight with a beautiful woman. He says, it will be done. He says, General, what's your last request? And the general sucks himself up to his full height of 5'9" and says, I would like to address the troops one more time. He says, it will be done. He says, Sergeant Major, what's your last request? Sergeant Major looks him in the eye and says, I want to be shot an hour before the general starts talking. So hopefully you won't feel that way when I'm done here. A little bit about the Army that you're joining. You're joining an organization that is already the best in the world at what it does. But it's an organization that's been at war for 8.5 years. And in that 8.5 years, it has never lost a battle. And that is an accomplishment unparalleled in the history of warfare. But because we've been at war for 8.5 years, we're also an army that is out of balance. And what I mean by that is we're so weighed down by the current demands that we can't do the things that we know we need to do to sustain this volunteer force for the long haul and to prepare ourselves to do other things. And that's the reality of it. And I read something a couple of weeks ago that said in the last month, the length of this war has exceeded the combined durations of World War I, World War II, and Korea. And we've done that with a volunteer force. And this is the longest war we have ever fought with a volunteer force. And every one of you is going to raise your right hand in a month or so and be commissioned and welcomed into an army where you know that you will go to war. And it speaks volumes for your character and your commitment to this great country. About 2007, we put ourselves on a program to get ourselves back in balance. And we said it was going to take us the better part of 4 years to do that. And that was, so we're now in our fourth year of getting ourselves back in balance. We said we had to do 4 things over those 4 years. We had to sustain soldiers and families. Our soldiers and families are the heart and soul of this organization, and we will not succeed without the quality of men and women that we're attracting into the Army today. Second, we had to continue to prepare soldiers for success in the current conflict. We are rotating 150,000 or so soldiers, actually it's a little less than that now, over and back to Iraq and Afghanistan every year. And we've been at that level really for about 6 years already. And so we cannot flinch on making sure that the people we're sending in harm's way have the training, have the equipment, and the manning to succeed. And we're doing a pretty good job of that. Third, we had to reset them effectively when they come back. Up until really late last year, for the last 5 years, we have been deploying soldiers 1 year in combat, 1 year home. Last year, we started getting it back up to 15 to 18 months between deployments. That is still a very tight turn. So we couldn't flinch on making sure that the equipment was replenished and fixed as quickly as we could. And just to give you an idea, that takes about $10 to $15 billion a year to reset a rotation. But we've made great progress on that. And lastly, we had to continue to transform for an uncertain future. We were a very good Army on September 11th. But it was an Army designed to fight large armored battles on the plains of Europe or the deserts of Saudi Arabia. And we have significantly transformed ourselves over the last decade into an Army that's far more relevant to the challenges that we're facing today. And let me tell you, to be able to transform ourselves, I mean, we have converted every brigade in the Army, over 300 brigades, to new organizations that are much more tailorable for packaging to go into different situations. A huge accomplishment. We have rebalanced ourselves. About 160,000 soldiers moving from skills that were very necessary in the Cold War to skills more needed today. For example, in that time, we've stood down over 200 tank companies, artillery batteries, and air defense batteries, and we've stood up a corresponding number of civil affairs, psychological operations, special forces, military police. Now, everybody that thinks they're going armored, don't worry about it. We got plenty of battalions for you out there. But a huge transformation and conversion. The other thing that's happening is we are realigning our bases. And there's a law that the Congress passes probably every decade or so that causes us to rearrange ourselves, base realignment and closure, BRAC they call it. We're moving about 380,000 soldiers, civilians, and family members here over the next 2 or 3 years. It's a lot of turbulence, but the upside of that is the facilities on our installations are modern and new, and it's a great plus. So we have continued to make progress to putting ourselves back in balance, and with the plus up in Afghanistan and with the projected drawdown in Iraq, we have a clarity on our force requirements that we haven't had in 3 years. And so what we're able to do is to work ourselves into a position where by 2011, 70% of the active Army will be deploying at a 1 year out, 2 years back ratio. And 80% of the Guard and Reserve will be deploying at a 1 year out, 4 years back ratio. That's hugely important because we've just completed a survey, a scientific survey that has shown us what we intuitively knew, that it takes 2 to 3 years to fully recover from a 1 year combat deployment. That's the reality of it. And when you go for you're home for less time than that, the effects are just cumulative. So we have to slow that pace down, and we're making good progress to that. So bottom line, good progress. I actually can see some breathing space over the course of late this year and early next year. And I know I was talking to some of you at lunch. You're not going to miss the war. There's still going to be plenty left for you out there. We're probably going to have 10 or more brigades deployed in combat, plus all the associated supporting forces for another decade. So that's what you're coming into, and that's what you can expect. Now let me talk a little bit about the environment and how we see the environment, because it gets to why we're organizing ourselves the way we are. First of all, we have been at war for 8.5 years, and we're involved in a long-term ideological struggle with a global extremist terrorist network that attacked us on our soil. And I see some people here with combat experience. you know that these are ruthless men and women, and they're not going to quit, they're not going to stop, and they're not going to give up. They're going to have to be beaten. But it's a long-term struggle because it is an ideological struggle. And so against that backdrop of the fact we were at war with these folks, we look at the trends we see in the global environment. And those trends seem to us more likely to exacerbate this conflict rather than to ameliorate it. What am I talking about? First of all, example, globalization. Up until a year or so ago, globalization was bringing prosperity to a lot of countries around the world. But unfortunately, that prosperity was unevenly distributed. And you had have and have-not countries. And the populations of those have-not countries are much more susceptible to recruiting by these extremist networks. Technology, another double-edged sword. The same technology that is being used to bring knowledge to anyone with a computer is being used by terrorists to export terror around the globe. Demographics, also going in the wrong direction. We have studies that say that the populations of some of these developing countries will double in 20 years. Can you imagine the population of Pakistan doubling in 20 years and the problems that would present an already strapped government? The other thing about demographics is people are increasingly moving to cities. By 2030, estimates are that 60% of the population of the world is going to live in cities. Those of you that have fought in the slums of Sadr City in Baghdad, an area 3 miles by 5 miles where 2 million people live. That is a tough operating environment. And the other part about demographics, it's going to increase as the populations grow, it's going to increase competition for resources. The middle classes in both China and India are already larger than the population of the United States. That's a lot of two-car families. And the two things that worry me most, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists, and that obviously worries the president a lot because he just brought leaders from all over the world into Washington to discuss that. But there's 1,300 or so terrorist organizations out there. There's no doubt that most of them are seeking some type of nuclear or radiological weapon, and I've been saying this since I watched 24 the last 2 weeks. But when they get it, I firmly believe they will attempt to use it against the developed country. And safe havens. Places around the world, countries or parts of countries where the government can't or won't deny their countries to terrorists. Places like Yemen. Places like Afghanistan before September 11th. And we can't turn a blind eye to those places because, as you saw on Christmas, that attack emanated from Yemen. So if you look at those trends, it seems to us that we're likely to be in a period of what we call persistent conflict for a decade or so. And I define persistent conflict as a period of protracted confrontation among states and non-states. But everyone will be increasingly willing to use violence to accomplish their political and ideological objectives. So we're going to be at this for a while, whether we like it or not. And we can't quit. We just can't walk off the field. We're in this for the long haul. Now, for me as Chief of Staff of the Army, it's not enough just to say, okay, we're going to be at this for a while. We have to look at what we think conflict is going to look like in the future. And I will tell you, and I talk about the future humbly, because I'm a firm believer in the old Yogi Berra adage, predictions are hard, especially when you're talking about the future. I mean, the flat fact of the matter is none of us can predict the future. We can study it, we can think about it, but we do that knowing the best we're ever going to do is get it about right. And if we get it 85%, man, we are golden. So that's what we do. So we have to look hard at conflict. And certainly Iraq and Afghanistan, those wars that we're fighting are harbingers of the way ahead. But we feel you also have to look at what happened in Lebanon in the summer of 2006. you had about 3,000 Hezbollah operatives embed themselves in the population areas just north of the Israeli border and basically fight 30,000 well-armed, well-trained, well-equipped Israeli forces to a standstill. Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, a non-state actor, supported by two states, Syria and Iran, operating inside a state, Lebanon, fighting another state, Israel. And the significant thing is you have a terrorist organization that has the instruments of state power. They started the war with over 13,000 rockets and missiles. Not just the small ones they shoot at our bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, but large missiles that they shot at Israeli population centers. They had unmanned aerial vehicles that they used to target the attacking Israeli forces. They had state-of-the-art anti-tank guided missiles. And they used improvised explosive devices to channelize the attacking Israeli armored forces into kill zones where they inflicted great casualties. 40% of the Israeli casualties came from anti-tank guided missiles. They had state-of-the-art surface-to-air missiles. They shot down an Israeli helicopter. They had cruise missiles. They hit an Israeli ship in the Mediterranean Sea with a cruise missile. They used secure cell phones to communicate and secure computers. And they got their message out on local television. That's a different ballgame. And one of the things that we see as we study these environments is the complexity. And I jokingly said to someone the other day, "Where's the 8th Guards Tank Army? Bring them back." That was as hard as it seemed to us then, it was a much easier challenge than we're facing today. So as we look at that, and we look at those trends, and we look at what we think warfare is going to be like, we are working to build an army that's a versatile mix of tailorable and networked organizations that are operating on a rotational cycle. Rotational cycle, much like the Navy and the Marine Corps have been operating on for years. But that is the direction we're moving with the Army. And we are organizing the entire Army into 3 force pools, active, guard, reserve. And each one of those force pools will contain a Corps headquarters, 5 division headquarters, 1 or 2 are guard, 20 brigade combat teams, 3 or 4 are guard, and 90,000 enabling forces, military, police, engineers, aviation. Half of those are guard and reserve. And we'll have 3 of those. But we have to do that because, as I said, we're going to be preparing and deploying forces for a decade, and we're going to be doing that with a volunteer force. And we have to let our soldiers and you all know a predictable and sustainable tempo. That's what you're going to be facing. So this is a big institutional change for us. But it's the only way I can see to sustain us through this period of persistent conflict. And by the time you get in there and get to your first unit, you should know exactly when you're going, roughly what year you're going in. Now, and I mentioned that, and that's what you'll stay a little bit about the complexity of the future environment. When you have complexity like that, it's leadership that makes the difference. And it is the leader who is able to chart the course through the complexity of these different environments. And you've all seen this, I'm sure, already, that when you're faced with something hard and very difficult, people can become flummoxed. And when you're flummoxed, nothing usually happens. And it takes leaders of character and competence to force their way through the complexity and lead. And in our Field Manual 3, you'll see a section there on leadership. And we say that we want our leaders to be leaders of character and competence who are supremely competent in their core proficiency, whatever that may be, and then broad enough to do a range of things. We want them to be culturally astute, to have the intellect to see opportunities that present themselves and the courage to act on them. And we want them to be firmly grounded in the warrior ethos. I will always place the mission first. I will never quit. I will never accept defeat. And I will never leave a fallen comrade. I pinned the Silver Star on a lieutenant that was probably sitting in this audience a couple of years ago. And Nick was on a patrol in Samarra, Iraq, that city where the Golden Mosque was that was blown up, that set off all the sectarian conflict in 2006. It was the middle of the night. They're walking down one of those narrow city roads, and those of you who've been in Iraq know there's wall compounds on either side, so you can't see what's on the other side. And all of a sudden, a hand grenade came over the wall, right into the middle of platoon. He reacted instinctively. He knew the grenade was going to hurt people in his platoon. He dove on it. It didn't go off. After a couple of seconds, he reached under it, grabbed it, threw it over the wall, and it went off. I said, Nick, what the heck did you think when it didn't go off? He says, I don't know, sir, I just reacted. I said, what did you think when it did go off? He said, I don't know, sir, I just reacted. But that's the kind of leaders that we're looking for. That's the kind of leaders that you will become. And let me just wrap up with a quote from the President's inaugural address. And this is toward the end of his address, speaking to the country. He held the men and women of the American Armed Forces up to the country as an example of what was necessary to move this country forward. He said, as we consider the role that unfolds before us, we remember with humble gratitude those brave Americans who at this very hour patrol far-off deserts and distant mountains. They've something to tell us, just as the fallen heroes who lie in Arlington whisper through the ages. We honor them not only because they are the guardians of our liberty, but because they embody the spirit of service, a willingness to find meaning in something greater than themselves. And yet at this moment, a moment that will define a generation, it's precisely this spirit that must inhabit us all. And it is precisely that spirit that inhabits each and every one of you sitting here today. Welcome to the profession of arms. Thank you.